Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I am Sara Malik, and in this semester I'll teach the course of 19th century poetry. And today is first lecture, so the topic of our lecture is Introduction to the 19th century poetry. So in this lecture we will be discussing different aspects of 19th century, its political, social and economic changes that took place in this era, and along with that what type of influences these political and these socio-political changes had on the poets and the literary figures of that time, and what type of literature was produced, and particularly focusing on the poetry of 19th century. So next we will discuss the course outline, that what would be our scheme of the lecture, how we will move from discussing 19th century till the 19th century poets. Okay, here we have the outline. Number 1, introduction to 19th century, and in this introduction we will discuss only the era, that which time period is called 19th century, and what were the socio-political and economic developments of that time, because the knowledge of such developments is very important, because without knowing the political landscape, the social changes, the economic developments, we cannot understand the influence of these changes on the literary figure of that time. Whenever we talk about literature, it always comes in, or we can say it always comes accompanied by the changes taking place and the effect of those changes on the mind and the psyche of the people of that time. All right, so in the next we will discuss 19th century literature. In literature we will look into the most important genres in which literature of that time was produced, which genre was most popular or most popularly read by the people, and and its third point is 19th century poetry, because it's the subject as well as the topic of today's lecture. So we will be focusing on poetry, its different features, which themes were recurrent or present at that time, and the subjects around which whole literature and particularly the poetry revolves. We will discuss all such aspects in point number 4. Next we have important poets of 19th century. We will discuss which poets were most widely read at that time and who also got fame in 19th century, and till date we also know which type, or which poets are most popular, and what were their poems, which type of work they produced, what were their themes, and what was the general or what were the general topics on which the poetry was written. So we will be discussing all such aspects in this lecture. Okay, let's move on. First of all, we will start discussing introduction to 19th century. I'm not talking about the literature and the poetry, but first of all we would like to understand which time period is called 19th century. Yes, the time period from 1801 to 1900 in the history of the world is called 19th century. Most mostly students think that it's 19th century, so it must have started from 1901, but it's not the case. From 1901 to 2000 it's called 20th century. So it happens because when we study history, so we got to know that the point where some century ends, it's named by that. For example, here it ends at 19, so we will name it as 19th century. So since the time we are living this time, so it's called 20th century, because 21st century, because this century will end at 2100. All right, so that is why it is called 21st century. Okay, in this time period there occurred many social political, and economic changes in the world. Yes, social three types of changes, although there were other changes as well. For example, the change occurred at scientific and technological level, but we are not going to discuss that particularly, but we are going to discuss the main changes which took place at this time. All right, social change. Which type of change took place? That slavery was abolished. All right, so social change that took place generally in the history. Okay, one of the changes that took place in that at that time was slavery. Okay, if we particularly talk about the British history, so changes that took place, it was uh, people's social change is accompanied by economic change, that they started living for before that there was agrarian society, but later on, because of the development of science and technology, it became industrial society. Likewise, the social condition of the people also changed. The poor become middle class people, and the upper class people. So these changes also took place. Slavery was abolished. It was abolished in America particularly. So if we look into that literature of 19th century of America, so we will have an idea that what happened to the or what changes took place in the abolition of the slavery. Number two, economic change, that is industrialization, led to massive urbanization. Yes, as I said earlier, that society shifted from agriculture to the industrial mode of economy. So, with the development of the economic means of earning, the social condition of the people also changed. They improved their class, they improved their lifestyle, their living. So like these were the economic changes that took place. All right, next is political change. What type of changes took place? That was collapse of the Holy Roman Empire and Mughal Empire. So these were the changes that took place around the world. Holy Roman Empire in Turkey, Ottoman Empire. Yes, it was Ottoman Empire. First of all, that was Holy Roman Empire. Then there was Ottoman. Yes, Ottoman Empire, which saw collapsed just right after the World War I. So these were the political changes that took place throughout the history, but they also influenced on the British as well. For example, this collapse of Mughal Empire that led to the arrival, or you can say the glory of the British Empire. So these were the changes that had their impact on the mind and the psyche of the people of particular areas. Next, if we consider, that is influence of British Empire. So what type of influence did have a British Empire had? British had the colonies in almost four continents of the world, where they had impact on the culture, on the language of those areas, on the people in general, and they were considered, and they were actually made slaves. So this is the impacts of such changes on the minds of the people we read in post-colonial literature. We will be studying later on. Okay. Yes, the political change that had impact on the poets and the writers of 19th century was French Revolution. Okay, the revolution that took place in the French, and it was a kind of revolution that was against the aristocratic class, the kings and the queens. The lower class, they had their demands of changing the aristocracy, because, or you can say the upper level ruling class, because they had been under such a suppression at the hand of such people. So they wanted a freedom, they wanted liberation. That is why that French Revolution took place. And in literature, yes, the poets and the writers also had influence of this revolution, and they pen down the impacts of such revolution in their writings as well. Yes. Next, 19th century literature. So we will discuss what type of literature was produced in 19th century. Particularly, there were three genres in which literature was mainly produced in 19th century. Yes, poetry, novel, and prose. I haven't included drama here because at that time drama was not used popularly, not even by the dramatist, and it was not um, you know um, liked by people, because uh, the kind of the drama that were produced at the time of Shakespeare and then produced at the time of modern period, that quality was not produced here. So that is why we will call that three genres that developed, in which the poetry or the in which the literature was produced, they are poetry, novel, and prose. These are the three main genres. Okay, first of all, we will discuss novelists of the 19th century. I'll just name such those novelists just to make you people familiar with the type of literature produced at that time, who were the novelists, and then particularly we will discuss poetry as that is the topic of our discussion. So Henry Fielding produced such works which were Joseph Andrews, yes, Tom Jones, Jonathan Wild. I'm just naming their works so that you may have an idea that what type of works and what were their names that were produced by these novelists. Okay, George Eliot, yes. Although the name shows that it seems that George Eliot is a man, but in reality she's woman, and she produced such works which are named as The Mill on the Floss, Adam Wade, Daniel Deronda, Middlemarch. At that time, it was not considered appropriate for women to do writings and to be famous in the among people. That is why she changed her pen name and she made it like used a man name just to conceal her identity, so that her writings are read by the people, and she is also not judged for writing about the topics which were considered like not of women type, that women should not discuss such topics such that like that. All right, next is Jane Austen. So Jane Austen, yes, she was also a brave lady, because at that time it was not considered appropriate for women to write, but still she had the courage to write with her own name, and she produced such masterpieces as Pride and Prejudice. There was Emma, Sense and Sensibility, Persuasion, Mansfield Park, and Northanger Abbey. She wrote 6 novels basically. Then we have Charlotte Bronte, and Charlotte Bronte had her famous novel that is Jane Eyre, and this novel is also included in the syllabus, I guess, of O levels. So she's also widely liked by the people who had interest in literature. All right, so next we have Emily Bronte. She wrote Wuthering Heights. Yes, her sister, that is her third sister, is Anne Bronte. She wrote Agnes Grey, the tenant of Wildfell Hall. They are called Bronte sisters. The three, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne Bronte, they are called the Bronte sisters. Next we have Charles Dickens. Yes, he is also widely read and most popularly known novelist of 19th century. His writings also had an impact of French Revolution, and on the basis of that revolution he wrote a novel that is A Tale of Two Cities, in which there is the story going on where the characters move from England, London and Paris, so they are the tale of two cities. Okay, he also wrote other novels, that is Bleak House, Great Expectations, and yes, Hard Times. They are his novels. Next is Thomas Hardy. Yes, he's one of my favorites as well. So Thomas Hardy, although he's called pessimist novelist, that he just show the dark side of the nature, but I don't think so. He's no pessimist. He talks about the reality, that how the life treats you, how the life actually is, what the realism is, what type of experiences you should expect being alive. So he tells that everyone has a destiny, and if someone tries to change the destiny and just ahead and just go against the nature's way of doing things, so he may face certain consequences. And his most popular novel is The Return of the Native. Other is The Mayor of Casterbridge, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Convergence of the Twine, Far from the Madding Crowd, and Jude the Obscure. So they are the novelists of 19th century. Yes. Yes, prose writers. One I just skipped it. Prose writers of 19th century. If we discuss what is prose, first of all, we need to understand what a prose is. Prose and poetry, they are almost contrasting. Prose, it's a Latin phrase which means straightforward. It is a kind of straightforward writing which can be in the form of essay, which can be in the form of any composition which is straightforward, which had a thought, which can be written on any moral, philosophical, and social subjects, and they have some moral purpose as well. While on the other hand, poetry is just for sake of pleasure. Although poetry is written on some real themes, but the way poetry is written, that is different from the prose. Poetry has a rhythmic effect. There are verses, all right, which rhyme with one another. On the other hand, prose is a straightforward writing. For instance, if you compose writing, and you start writing your thoughts on the page, there is a connection between the thoughts. There is continuity in whatever you are writing. So that is what you called a prose. So there were many prose writers. I would like to name them and their works as well. Number one is Charles Lamb, William Hazlitt, Thomas De Quincey, Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, and John Macaulay. All right, so I would like to name their works just so that you may get acquaintance with them. Number one, Charles Lamb. He wrote Essays of Elia, Last Essays. Then yes, William Hazlitt wrote A Man of Violent Temper, The Spirit of the Age. Thomas De Quincey wrote essay of his autobiographical sketches. The best known is Confessions of an English Opium. Yes, his historical essay, Joan of Arc, Personages, Biography of Person, The Carriers, yes, Literature on the Knocking at the Gate in Macbeth, yes, also wrote on Goethe, Pope, Schiller, and Shakespeare. Next we have Thomas Carlyle. He wrote French Revolution, Heroes and Hero Worship, Past and Present, Letters and Speeches of Oliver Cromwell, Latter Day Pamphlets. Next, John Ruskin. He wrote Modern Painters, The Seven Lamps of Architecture, The Stone of Venice, The Crown of Wild Olive. Yes, it's next is Thomas Macaulay. It's a mistake, sorry. It's not John Macaulay, it's Thomas Macaulay. He wrote autobiographical and critical essays. He wrote essays on history of England. All right, so next we will move on to discussing poetry. Now here comes our title, the topic, that is poetry of 19th century. It's a subject as well. Poetry is a literary work in which the expression of feelings and ideas is given intensity by the use of distinctive style and rhythm. Poems collectively or as a genre of literature. They are a genre of literature. So what is poetry? In which you just express your feelings, you express your ideas, not particularly the feelings but the ideas as well, that whatever you have in your mind, you want some kind of change in the world, you want to change the minds of the people, you use poetry. For instance, if we consider the poetry of Iqbal, his poetry was revolutionary, having an impact on the people. So poetry is not just about arousing the feelings of the people, but it also had some moral appeal as well. So what makes poetry different from other genres is that its style, the style in which it is written. It is written in rhythmic, in poetic style. There are verses, they have the rhymes with one another, there are specific arrangement of sentences, words arranged in a sentence. So that makes poetry beautiful. Yes, so poetry, if we discuss the technicalities involved in the poetry, so we will have this definition that poetry is a type of literature based on the interplay of words and rhythm. Yes, you use words. Interplay means to employ words, to use word according to your own need. And then yes, there is rhythm means there is musicality, there is rise and fall of in this utterance, in the pronunciation of the words. It often employs rhyme and meter. Meter is called length, and rhyme is that musical effect, a set of rules governing the number and arrangement of syllables in each line. How the words are arranged, that determines its meter and the rhyme as well. In poetry, words are strung together to form sounds, images, and ideas that might be too complex or abstract to describe directly. So it happens that in brief, or you can say concisely, you in few words you convey a big thought. So that is one of the characteristics of poetry. So it has its appeal, it is widely liked by people in one way or the other. So that is what we call a poetry. Yes, there are certain features of 19th century poetry. 19th century poetry had imagination in them. Poets wrote on the imagination themes, like they had imagined something in their mind, and they wrote it. For example, Wordsworth, he wrote about in his poem, that is Daffodils, that he was sitting on the couch, and that there came a thought of the daffodils in his mind, and he said, when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they came upon my inward thought, uh, and then my heart players with fills and dances with daffodils. So this is how the Wordsworth imagine the scene of daffodils. And there's love for nature. Wordsworth had also love for nature. He called nature his a nurse as well, a healer, a friend. He looks into the nature to cure his sufferings. There is sensuousness in poetry. Sensuous means having it is related to the senses. For example, sense of smell, sense of sight, sense of touch. So these are the senses. You read the poetry and you feel that you are also listening to that, you are also hearing, watching, you are also using your senses. For example, Keats says in Ode on Negation Urn that heard melodies are sweet and those unheard are sweeter. So your sense of hearing becomes active at that time. There is supernaturalism. Yes, supernaturalism, this element was used by S.T. Coleridge. There is Hellenism. Hellenism is related to the Greek mythology. Yes, Hellenism is related to Greek myths because there was a Queen Helen, she was a goddess of beauty. So related to that, Keats has also used such concept in his poems. Ode on Negation Urn. Then there is escapism, that escape from the reality. You don't want to face something that is happening in front of you, because that thing you think that it will affect your mind, your senses. So poets has also used this theme in their poetry. We will discuss later. Then there is realism. When there came the time that development took place in science and technology, and there was realist themes. They talked about the life. Poets talk about the life, the severity, the seriousness in the life. Then there is science and technology, that because of the technology there was industrialization, and because of industrialization there was urbanization, and a family circle was declining. People became more career oriented. So those type of these type of feature we find in the 19th century poetry. Yes, important points. The 19th century, we have William Wordsworth. He wrote, William Wordsworth is also known as the poet of the nature. He wrote such poems which had their nature themes, which revolved around the nature, in which he had ascribed nature as as nurse, as healer, as friend, and he sought refuge in nature as well. His poems include Tintern Abbey, Odd Intimations of Immorality, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. Yes, then there is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. We also know him as S.T. Coleridge. He along with William Wordsworth, they produced their masterpiece, that is the Prelude. It is a collection of poems, and yes, Wordsworth wrote the Prelude, and then Wordsworth and Coleridge wrote lyrical ballads in 1798. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, he wrote The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Then his few poems were published unfinished, which were Christabel and Kubla Khan. Yes, P.B. Shelley, he wrote Ode to the West Wind, To a Skylark, Adonais, A Dirge, Ode to Liberties, and while we have John Keats, and John Keats wrote poems on To Solitude. His first collection is written, which is named as To Solitude, and he also wrote Ode on a Grecian Urn. There is Ode to a Nightingale, Ode to Psyche, Endymion, Hyperion. I did not include one of the poems that his Robert Browning. Although he belonged to the Victorian era, but he's also comes in the poets of the 19th century. He wrote Bishop Orders, his Storm, Andrea del Sarto, Fra Lippi, My Last Duchies. These were the important poets of 19th century. To conclude our lecture, I would like to say that 19th century poetry has its own significance in the history of English literature, particularly the British literature. And whenever we talk about the literature, we never talk about in its seclusion, because literature is produced in conjunction with the scientific, with the social, with the political and economic developments taking place at that time. So we cannot study literature only through the words, but words on the pages, but the background of that era in which literature was produced, that is also important. So that's all for today's lecture, and I hope you have understood it well. Thank you.